Hey, everyone. Pastor George here with today's episode of a new thing. How exciting, right? How exciting. Today we're going to be talking about something that I really have no great knowledge and experience of, but that's okay because the person who I'm talking to, or talking about rather, who you guys are going to be hearing from, also doesn't know that much. So this is exactly what you want, right? Two people who don't know much talking about something that they really have no business talking about. But really, I mean, I wanted to just talk a little bit about this issue in our modern times because it's become something that's so important. And it's recently made waves in the area that I'm going to talk about, or like because of this person. And so I think it's worth just reiterating and thinking about, because it's important that we talk about this because it's such an issue, and the language about it has just infected our culture. So first things first, though, to set the stage for what I'm going to be talking about, which is mental illness, we are going to look at the Bible. And we're going to look at Lamentations chapter 3. And you're going to recognize a lot of that. That's what the video we're going to be watching. So Lamentations 3, I picked out a few verses. So there's 3, 1 through 3, 21 through 25, and 31 through 33. Lamentations 3 is long, so we're not going to read the whole thing. But I wanted to get the general gist of Lamentations 3 together here. I found this to be helpful when we speak about things like depression or anxiety or all sorts of things that our mind can deal with, because it talks about how, and maybe even like PTSD. This is one of the things I used in the military sometimes, and I think it's important because it talks about how we're reacting to the things that we've seen or heard, but also remembering that the Lord is good and faithful. So this is what it says. It says, "I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of the Lord's wrath. He has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. Indeed, he has turned his hand against me again and again all day long. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. For no one is cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love, for he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone." So, this is important when it comes to talking about mental illness, because we have to think about like what our reaction is to it, because and what the Lord's role in it is, because there's something to be said for, because the complaint you're going to hear from someone, and I'm going to set it up, is that mental illness is a fiction, right? And it's not something I believe, so I just want to say that off the bat. But there certainly is something to be said about action. And we can't just say, oh, there's some sort of mental problem, because that usually just gets rid of any sort of personal action or belief on the side of the person. But at the same time, I think there's tacit understanding in human minds that's when we experience or go through things that this can have effects on us, and we have to be able to deal with those things. So, the reason I'm talking about this today, and I should just say, and I think Lamentations deals with that, because what it's dealing with is it's dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem and all the bad stuff that happened there, and how the Lord is still faithful in that, right? It's a lament, it's a lamentation, because it's a lamentation over the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile. And so when it's talking about all of that, it's not talking about small stuff, it's talking about like the things that people would have experienced and seen in war. And I imagine that I really don't need to tell you what you could probably imagine that those things are. And so I think it's important for us just to remember that, because what we're going to do is we're going to look at this panel discussion that was done by Grace Point Church in California, and this is John MacArthur's church. I don't think this one is his, but it's kind of in the same area. And John MacArthur's a pastor out there, and very well known. I have his commentary on the shelf. I don't agree with him on everything. In fact, I would say outside of like some things about the Reformed faith that I agree with him on, we disagree on a lot. Now, do I think he's like not a Christian or anything? No, he absolutely is. But he say that about me? I don't think so. Or maybe a little bit he would say that about me. I'm not sure. In any case, I'm not here to disprove or prove anything about that. All that is to say is that I find him to be very anti-establishment, which isn't necessarily bad, but also very dogmatic in a lot of his statements, and you're going to see that come out here. And he's kind of always been like this. Like, it's only like every few months he says or does something, and it sets everyone off. And so recently they've been having this panel at this church. I've had a few pastors come on and talk about to raise kids. And this is a question that's asked of John MacArthur. So I'm going to play it for us, and that way you can see what he says. Pull it up.
I want to ask you a question here. He's written a lot of books, but his last book was The War on Children. Help our families navigate with the day we live in, and why you even wrote that.
Well, it's a combination of things. Just to lay it out simply, kids are sinful. I have great-grandchildren, and by the time they're 3 or 4, their sin nature is starting to be manifest.
Wait, even in your grandchildren?
Even in my...
Okay.
So, I mean, like, yeah, they're having a little fun with that or whatever. I mean, that's true. Obviously, like anyone who's ever raised kids or been around children for any length of time should know this, that children are sinful. Everyone's sinful. I would even put it farther back than 3 or 4, but that's just me personally. So anyway, this is that's what they're talking about. They're talking about thing, and they asked John MacArthur about this book that he recently published.
So kids are sinful. Then you add to that the sins of the fathers are visited on the generations, the 3rd and the 4th generation. What does that mean? Simply means that the sinful characteristics of a given generation pass on to the subsequent generations. So that it's kids who basically have a sin nature to start with, and they have an inherited sin culture that they have to navigate and deal with. That ought to be enough. But this culture has taken it a step further.
So I just want to say I think that's true. Like, I do think that the Bible does talk about that, right? Like, that the Lord will revisit payment for sins on the 3rd and 4th generation. And oftentimes we go, oh, that seems so unjust. Like, why are you punishing children for the sins of the father? That's not really what's happening in those texts. What's happening is that the Lord is basically saying, if you don't change, those same sins are going to be punished for you, your children, because these sins carry down generationally if no one really stops it from happening. And I think that you easily see this in families. So, like, for instance, and I'm like, if there's alcoholism or drug abuse, right, those can be seen and being passed down through families. Now, of course, some people argue that is certain disposition and certain or an illness in and of itself. I'm not going to comment on that. I simply don't know enough. All I can say is that I don't think it's simply that, being someone who's kind of dealt with people who deal with substance abuse issues, is sure, like, there might be dispositions, but ultimately, if one chooses to take or do these types of things, that is sin, right? You don't get out of an out of jail free card just because we have a disposition, because all of us have a disposition to sin. And so it's just important to note that can be passed down through families, and if it isn't, looked after or contained or punished or anything else, then that can lead to further problems, right? And then you end up having people who are dealing with the same stuff that their great grandparents did, because no one has really disrupted that sinful system.
And they are now targeting children. The homosexuals say, we're coming after your kids.
Now you can see where this is going. He doesn't actually say much about that, but and I'm just gonna leave that there. I'm just gonna keep going.
But they're not trying to protect them. They're targeting them in the schools. They're targeting them through the media. Disney and companies like that develop child entertainment are targeting children for really what amounts to moral and spiritual destruction.
So this is, remember when I said John MacArthur's anti-establishment? This is like where you really see that, right? And he's very much aligned himself with this us against the world mentality type of thing. Now, of course, he would say to me, well, we are supposed to be against the world. We're Christians. And I would say, yeah, I agree that a lot of the sinful parts of the world, but he reads in a cynicism into everything, right? Like, certainly, like, there is a lot of this crazy progressive messaging that you see directed towards kids. I'm not going to deny that. And parents should be on the lookout for that type of stuff, the same way they should be on the lookout for all sorts of bad messaging coming to their kids. But I think that the question here is, like, you know, like, it reads in a lot of assumptions. So, like, I don't think Disney is doing that in the sense of, like, trying to change people's hearts and minds. I think Disney is just doing that because they're feeding the culture what it wants to see. And so he kind of presents it to me like a cabal thinking about all these evil things, and it's like, oh, let's corrupt children, when in reality that's just our society is already dealing with all these sin issues, and Disney's just like, we can make money off this. Because that's if you ever see corporations do anything, right? Pride Month is coming up, or during Black History Month, or during all sorts of other political times and statements or whatever. Just know that unless they have a long track record of actually caring, and there are very few companies that actually do that, it's done in order to make money. So don't read too much into some of the choices that companies make. I mean, we can still say they're bad choices or good choices, but we have to remember that people are motivated. A lot of corporations are profit-making things, right? So they are supposed to make money, and that's what they want to do. So don't buy their own propaganda in that respect.
So this is a war on the children. I was thinking about another part of it the other day. I was reading a book.
So this is the part that I wanted to talk about. This is the main thing that he's going to go off on.
Interesting book called A Profession Without Reason. It's a book that shows basically, this is pretty shocking to some of you, that psychiatry and psychology is finally admitting the noble lies that they've been telling for the last 100 years. And the major noble lie is there is such a thing as mental illness. Now, this isn't new. You have Thomas Szasz back in the 1950s writing a book, who was a psychiatrist, on the myth of mental illness. There's no such thing as PTSD. There's no such thing as OCD. There's no such thing as ADHD. Those are noble lies. To basically give the excuse to, in the end of the day, to medicate people.
So you can see that that's real. This whole thing is really what set a lot of people off. You'd think it would be the first kind of part that we just briefly touched on, because that's a little bit more bombastic. But really, people expect that from John MacArthur. So that's not the kind of shocking thing for a lot of people. The shocking thing for a lot of people was the statement that there's no such thing as mental illness. And then he lists these concepts that are not like that many of us use, throw around, take for granted, and say that they don't really exist, that they were made up by the profession of psychology and psychiatry, and that they're used to medicate kids. So put a pin in that. We're going to keep listening because I want to return to kind of the books he's talking about, so we can look at them a little bit.
And Big Pharma is in charge of a lot of that.
And you have to remember, like, that this is built into the anti-establishment, very American thing, right? Big Pharma. Already, most of us are like, when we hear that, we have negative feelings about that, and that's because it's, big anything in the United States brings negative feelings to us. So just notice the political and anti-establishment language that's here, because that's going to, I argue, form a more major part of why MacArthur believes that he believes than, any sort of biblical grounding.
If you understand, take PTSD for example. What that really is grief. You are fighting a war, you lost your buddies, you have a certain amount of survival guilt because you made it back, they didn't. How do you deal with the grief? Grief is a real thing. But grief is part of life. And if you can't navigate grief, you can't live life. But if you clinically define that, you can give them a pill, a series of medications, and they end up in LA homeless on the sidewalk.
So I would say that, all right, so for anyone who doesn't know, I was a chaplain in the Navy, and in the military, for the people who are going to be providing care for soldiers, they do a ton of PTSD work, which makes sense. I'm sure I don't need to explain to you why that's something that they care about. So, given the example he uses, still to us this day, if we think of PTSD, we think of military. In fact, this has been a pretty big debate recently because so many people have been claiming, like, I have trauma, I have PTSD, all sorts of things like that. And the gut reaction on people like me, I'm like on the other end of MacArthur. Not really, but this is like my gut reaction is to say, actually, you don't. You only have PTSD if you've seen your buddy get blown to pieces by an IED, right? If you haven't seen that, then you don't count. Like, I'm sorry that someone was mean to you sometime, right? But that's not trauma. Now, I think that that's too harsh, right? And so, but that's like my gut reaction. I think the gut reaction of many people when they hear like a teenager say, this is so traumatic or something like that. But like generally that is not how PTSD is treated in the military. And I can't speak, but that's all I can speak to. I can't speak to how it's dealt with psychiatry. I don't know if pills are the natural way. Usually there's lots of different types of therapy that people can try, obviously like pastoral counseling for the religious people, but also, all sorts of art and like, normal therapy and things like that. Usually in my witness is if a veteran is dealing with PTSD and ends up on the street, it's not because of taking pills that a doctor gave them. It's usually because they try to self-medicate with drugs and alcohol, and because that can numb a lot of the symptoms, right? It's MacArthur here says it's grief, that PTSD is grief. That's definitely a part of it. I'm not going to say that grief is not a part of it, but also grief doesn't, like if you hear a loud bang, cause you to jump on the hood of your car, to get out of your car and jump on the hood of it, or to hide under tables, right? It's clearly not just grief. Most people have experienced tremendous grief, right? I do grief share. That's not a natural reaction for most people. And so we have to be honest that there is a change in. I am so upset because I don't even. I broke in, so you notice that I just broke into this video mid-thought. I realized at this point, only like after 10 or 15 more minutes of recording, that apparently it had stopped recording because I didn't have enough space, even though my computer has like 5 gigs free. So here's what I'm going to say, because you just missed the whole rest of that video. Is that MacArthur goes on to talk about how we over medicate kids. Agreed. I think most of us would say, yeah, you know what, fair. But here's my big issue, and I'm going to bring us back to Lamentations 3. I just did this, so if I rush through this, it's because I've thought about it and I don't remember what I've said. So I really apologize for that. My computer, I really need to get my new computer in the office. I've just been too lazy. All right, so here's the thing. Oh, and the books. He mentions the myth of mental illness, if you watch the rest of it, and he mentions a profession without reason. You'll notice he doesn't mention any biblical books to talk about mental illness, which I think is pretty important, because if we're going to be talking about this in a pastoral way, we have to be thinking about the Bible. Instead, he really roots a lot of it in anti-establishment thinking, which I think can be helpful sometimes. I'm not saying anything against Zaz or the other guy. It's just that we can't just frame ourselves only as anti-establishment, because that can lead us to throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I don't think everything that is taught in modern psychology and psychiatry is wrong, even if there are definitely areas where we can critique and where they need to pull back. I think most of us would agree with that. But we can't go as far as to say that mental illness doesn't exist, like MacArthur will say, because we have to be, we can see in the testimony of Scripture that humans are dealing with these mental problems. So Lamentations 3, the reason I chose that is because it's really good at showing this, I think. I think you could take someone who is dealing with mental illness and give them this passage and walk them through it and help them understand kind of what the Christian view of it is, which is, firstly, at the beginning, as you can see here, and what I pointed out, is that it's based on something that has happened to the person. Now, Lamentations was written when it comes to dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem and seeing just the awful things that happened there. And so you can imagine in the wake of a destruction of a city what awful things would happen, from all sorts of war crimes to fighting to disease to starvation to all sorts of stuff, right? To the whole society as you know it kind of crumbling down. And that would lead to someone dealing with a lot of things that we would probably call mental illness or mental problems, right? Depression, anxiety, PTSD, all sorts of things, right? And I think that here there's things that Lamentations is really strong about because it roots it in things that's seen. And if you look at the full chapter, right, if I were to show you this full thing, it talks about all the problems that the author is experiencing, both physical and mental, right? Like, he has barred my way with blocks of stone. He has made my paths crooked. Like, is that a physical description? Well, no, right? This is metaphorical language talking about what the author is experiencing. And I think it's clear that, like, some of this is definitely having physical effects on the person's body, but also mental effects too. All right. And that's, you know, I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I will remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. And then it changes to that center part, which we all know because of the hymn. Yet I call this to mind. And he goes on that their blessings are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. And I think so, as Christians who are dealing, sorry to rush this, but I just recorded like for 40 minutes and didn't get anything. But this is my overall take on this, is that as Christians, we need to be able to affirm people in the struggles that they're going through, but also offer them the hope. Because oftentimes the thing is, hey, sorry, this is just who you are now. You're never going to get over it. Here's a pill, right? That's what often happens to a lot of people. And I think that MacArthur's pushing back against that, except he overcorrects and goes too far. Whereas we could say, you know what, that is something you're dealing with. And if that pill helps, we can, that's good. But we can't stop there, right? We need you should seek complete and total healing, and that can be found in the Lord. Now, is that saying that you're, you know, if you're dealing with depression, then it's going to go away as soon as you believe? No, right? Some people deal with that kind of continually. That is the problem that they're dealing with. Like Paul had an issue that he never got rid of, right? Sometimes God's strength is made perfect in weakness. All of us kind of have issues that we might deal with our whole lives. But the point is that when we root ourselves in the Lord, we begin to root ourselves out of these things, because that's what's become very common is people start to identify themselves with these issues, these problems that they're having, rather than who they are outside of them. It's like, oh no, I have PTSD and that's my thing, or I'm dealing with anxiety or depression, and that's like me. That's a core part of me. And the Christian gospel, right? The Christian teaching rejects that. It says, yes, this is a sin, not in the sense of like you're committing a sin because you have depression or whatever, but it's a sin in the sense of like it's a mark of sin. Something happened in your life that, or is a sin of the world, and it's difficult for you to deal with. Now, sometimes it could be your own sin, but we like that's not where the story ends. We need to push you past that point and get you to realize and trust in the Lord, so you can say, you know, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him, and to enjoy or try to enjoy life again, knowing that this is something that doesn't define you, but rather it's the fact that you're a child of the Lord. So that's really the push. I'm sorry that I lost all of that stuff. That sucks. But yeah. I just can't. I just don't have enough time to record another 40 minutes. So you're going to be stuck with this really truncated version. I apologize for that. All that's to say is that MacArthur, he shoots from the hip a lot. And I want to be very clear that I also am not an expert. So take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. Just that we as Christians should know and have sympathy for people, and work with them to help them understand that God is calling them out of these problems that we face in this world, and into new life in Christ. And so that's all I wanted to say. Sorry again about the video. I'm sure that was very jarring for you. And I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your Thursday, and I will see you on Sunday for worship. Man, I'm already dead, and it's just the beginning of the day. Hope you guys have a good one. Peace out.